Hi guys, and welcome to your Directional Terminology lecture. The PowerPoint we're going to go over just has a couple slides, and then I wanted to go through the notes that you have. So let's get started talking about where things are. So we are going to be doing this Directional Terminology lecture right here. And you can find this in Schoology. We are in Unit 2, External Anatomy and the Skeletal System. So that's the PowerPoint right there. The notes are located right behind, below there, and those are the Directional Terminology lecture notes. So let's get started. So here's the PowerPoint. Let's go ahead and get this thing started. So this figure is in your guys' notes. So we in class use colored pencils to illustrate and to color in things for this lecture. So, all right, so we have posterior at the bottom. So it is at the rear of the horse here, the rear of the horse, posterior. And then the opposite of that would be anterior. So that is towards the front region. So the posterior is towards the tail, the anterior is towards the head. So another set of terms that also means towards the head and towards the tail are cranial and caudal. So cranial means towards the head, the cranium, the head, and then caudal means towards the tail. As we get into medical terminology, cauda means tail, so you'll understand that caudal means tail. So we have anterior and posterior and cranial and caudal. Then we have dorsal. So dorsal runs along the back. It's like everything that the sun touches on a four-legged animal. So that also includes the top of a four-legged animal's head. So that is dorsal. So dorsal runs along the back, and it's also the top of the head of a four-legged animal. The opposite of that we have is ventral. So ventral is that underneath part. So underneath the animal's throat latch onto the chest area, and then the belly is also the ventral area. All right, we also have proximal and distal. So proximal is closer to the animal's body or closer to the midline of the animal, and distal is further off in the distance. So distal off into the distance, so further towards the hoof. So my elbow is proximal to my wrist. My wrist is off into the distance, that is more distal, and my elbow is more proximal because it is closer to the body. All right, moving on to the next slide, we start learning about surface planes. And in directional terminology, we use this when we're talking about dissection. We use it when we're talking about wounds. We use medical terminology all the time in directional terminology when we're explaining where an injury is on an animal or a laceration or something like that, an incision. So the frontal plane divides both dorsal from ventral. So the frontal plane divides dorsal from ventral. So dorsal is along the back and ventral is along the belly region. It also divides proximal from distal. So the frontal plane divides two things. So dorsal from ventral, but also proximal from distal. The next one we have is the median plane. So the median plane divides the animal in half down the midline. So it divides the animal in half down the midline. So the midline goes straight down the animal's body, dividing it into two halves, and the median plane runs down the midline to divide the animal into half. The sagittal plane then divides that animal's half into half. So if you have half of the animal's body, the sagittal plane then divides that animal's half into half. So it would go up that horse's leg and cut that leg kind of in half. It'd shave off part of the chest and belly area and then go down through the back leg as well to complete the sagittal plane. And then we have the transverse plane. So the transverse plane divides cranial from caudal, or anterior from posterior, since those two terms are similar. So transverse plane, it goes along the animal's body anywhere that it's dividing cranial from caudal. And then we have superficial and deep. So superficial is more towards the surface, and then deep would be more towards the core of the animal. So superficial would be like the epidermis is the top layer of the skin, and then deep you would have the animal's bones are deep within the animal's body. And I'll explain that a little bit more when we go over the notes, the colored notes that I have. So that is it for the directional terminology PowerPoint. And now we are going to open up my colored notes here and go through those. So here is your directional terminology lecture notes. You have the terms to know here. So we did go over anterior, the front of the animal's body. Caudal is towards the tail. Cranial is towards the cranium, the head of the animal. Deep is further from the surface. Distal is off in the distance, so the furthest portion of the animal's body. The dorsal runs along the back or the uppermost surface of a four-legged animal. Frontal plane divides the animal into dorsal and ventral planes. Lateral side of the animal. Later means side. As we get into the medical terminology that you guys are going to start to learn that goes hand in hand with anatomy and physiology, you will learn that later means side. Median, it's the body plane that divides the animal into two equal halves. So it goes right down the midline. The median plane goes right down the midline. Posterior is towards the rear of the animal. Proximal is the body part that is closest to the core of the animal's body. The sagittal plane, any body plane that is parallel to the median plane and kind of divides off sections of that animal. Superficial is closer to the surface. So if you're talking skin layers, the epidermis is on top, and then you have the dermis and the subcutaneous layer. So the subcutaneous layer would be deep, and then the epidermis would be superficial. And then we have transverse plane that divides the body into cranial and caudal parts, and the ventral surface runs under the four-legged animal's chin, and then by the pectorals, the chest area, and then under the belly. All right, so everything that I have said word-wise is written here. We like to give you guys things a couple different ways. So we have things in writing. So here is that slide that we had, and I just kind of did things in color. So this is what you guys will be doing in class when you listen to our lecture in class. If you're not in class, this is what you could do on your own. And so I just tried to make it a little colorful. So you have anterior towards the head of the animal, posterior towards the tail end. You can see dorsal runs the top of the head of the animal all along the back, and then the ventral, we have that under the chin, the chest, and the belly area. Proximal, I tried to show that that was closer to the core of the body, where distal is more towards the hoof or further away from the animal. And then we have cranial and caudal down below, meaning towards the head, the cranium, and towards the tail, cauda. All right, again, more terminology written out for you about the planes, the dissection planes. And then we have the planes. So the median plane here goes down the midline of the animal, dividing it into half. Then you have that sagittal plane that runs through the hoof of the animal, and then the chest and the belly area, and then back down that back leg as well. You have the transverse planes that divide the cranial from the caudal. And transverse planes can be anywhere in through the animal's body as long as it's dividing cranial from caudal. You have the frontal plane here that divides dorsal from ventral, and then frontal plane also in a limb would divide proximal from distal as well. So frontal plane divides dorsal from ventral and also proximal from distal if you're talking about a limb. A lot of times when we're talking about injuries and lacerations and stuff like that, we use the words superficial and deep. So I did my best to give a little drawing over here of some different layers. The green in the middle here would maybe be considered the animal's bone, and then we would have muscle and tissue layers and a skin layer on top of that. So you can see the deeper layers, like the polka dot layer is deep, whereas the squiggly red line layer is more superficial. So superficial and deep. So the laceration cut deep towards the tibia and cut through all layers of the skin, or the wound was very superficial and only cut through the epidermis and dermal layers of the skin. So those are kind of ways that we can use the directional terminology when we're talking about wounds and injuries of animals and humans, for that fact. All right, I think that is it. So as always, if you guys have any questions, please let us know, and hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.